and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. You're watching Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Prolonged conflict, increasing protectionism, and an emerging multipolar world. How will Singapore position itself amid a changing world order? Joining me on the show tonight to share more about Singapore's foreign policy priorities amid all of these multiple global anxieties, we have His Excellency Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan. He's Singapore's Minister for Foreign Affairs. Minister, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I'm hoping we could begin our conversation close to home, starting with the relationship of our two countries.
Yes.
This 4-day trip marks, I think, your first trip to Malaysia since Anwar Ibrahim became the 10th Prime Minister November last year. How do you envision bilateral ties between our two countries strengthening under the Anwar administration? I'm hoping you can give us some clear areas of focus for cooperation.
Well, this year is the 60th anniversary of Malaysia and the 58th year of independence for Singapore. So I think the first point is we are inseparable. Yes, there has been tumultuous political changes over the last 60 years, but the fact is we are your permanent neighbor. First point.
Okay.
The second point is because nearly 6 decades have passed, I think some of that emotional baggage has dissipated.
Okay.
And you've got new leaders. You know, you've got a new Prime Minister Anwar, and we in turn, Singapore is also going through a leadership transition. That's the second point. The third point, and this really relates to COVID, I can tell you honestly, I can still remember the 18th of March 2020 when the MCO was announced and the causeway was closed. This has never ever happened in our lifetime. If you go back in history, you probably have to go back to the Second World War when the British blew up the causeway because they wanted to slow down the advance of the Japanese. But what I can tell you from inside the scenes is that the enormous amount of coordination, communication, mutual support between Singapore and Malaysia during these 3 years of COVID, making sure supply chains continued, flow of food, vegetables, eggs, industrial products, pharmaceuticals, vaccines. The two of us stood by each other. We didn't drop the ball. We looked after each other. And that built up an enormous reservoir of trust. So that's the other point.
Right. That
in a crisis, we came through together, we've come through stronger. So, you know, it's great to be back. And I should also tell you, in the last 3 years of COVID, I've been to Malaysia every single year.
Okay, so you haven't left those ties unchecked. I do want to talk to you about, so when you talked about the free flow, the movement, the coordination needed to ensure that the ties remained despite the lockdown, despite the pandemic. A large part of that was also the Malaysian workforce who live and work in Singapore, who then weren't able to travel.
Yes.
That, I think, speaks very closely to Malaysians, the idea that many Malaysians are now living and working in Singapore, the Malaysian brain drain. Singapore's role in that, if I may ask you, I mean,
well,
is that role is that by design or inadvertent?
We are kindred souls. We're related. Blood, society, marriage. And again, the example of COVID, you know, and I think if you ask the Malaysians, some of whom decided to stay with us or were kind of almost stuck with us, they will know that Singaporeans were hospitable. We looked, as I said, we looked out and we looked after each other. And this applied both ways. I'll tell you another thing. Many of the appeals the foreign minister in Malaysia and the foreign minister in Singapore received during those times were heartbreaking appeals. My grandmother is dying. My father is in ICU. I need to see them one last time. You know, it again illustrated that very close heart-to-heart ties between us. And that's why when I said we're inseparable, this is not about politics. It's people to people. That's really what was emphasized. And COVID was a stark reminder of that.
Right. Okay, if I may shift the conversation to the region. So we're talking about our bilateral ties, but we
Yes.
also have other ties with our neighbors, with
Yes.
ASEAN, and specifically with Myanmar, if I may. Almost exactly 2 years
Yes.
to the day of the Myanmar military toppling over a democratically elected government. How are you seeing the role of Singapore in relation to the crisis in Myanmar, not just through ASEAN, but with the people of Myanmar who have led the country since the coup?
The coup was a grave disappointment, an enormous setback. And I think all of us have friends from Myanmar. And you know what an enormous, deep sense of regret that has resulted from that. Our efforts are really working through ASEAN and the ASEAN 5-point consensus, which our leaders agreed on, and which Myanmar too agreed to. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any significant progress.
Right.
Violence continues. Real political dialogue between the key stakeholders is not happening. And without that national reconciliation, you're not going to get peace. You're not going to be able to reconstruct and put Myanmar and its people back on the trajectory that they so richly deserve. So it's sad. 2 years later, we're still in this situation.
How do we achieve that political dialogue, again, with the five-point consensus?
Yes.
It seems like, is that the only democratic process, the only diplomatic process at play at the moment? Is there any other way to encourage political dialogue, given that it's failed, the 5-point consensus has failed?
I have to say there is no other alternative, and we do need to be patient. The military in Myanmar has a very high tolerance for pain, especially when the pain is felt by people, their people, but not in their immediate families. And if you look at the tortured history of Myanmar over the past 6-7 decades, it's been a very difficult history. So I think the first point I want to emphasize is the need for patience. Second, it doesn't mean giving up hope or abandoning all action, but to keep cajoling, persuading, encouraging, facilitating this dialogue. Now, the other point worth emphasizing is national reconciliation can only occur domestically, internally. It is not something which can be imposed from outside. And this is another key principle of ASEAN, that we will not interfere in the domestic political arrangements of each country. Now, you have to hope that the leaders across the spectrum in Myanmar come to that realization that they do need to have honest-to-goodness conversations, they do need to reconcile, and they need to do so for the sake of their own people.
But as we are waiting patiently, the people of Myanmar are suffering atrocities.
Absolutely. There have been estimates that 40% of the population of Myanmar are below the poverty line.
How long are we going to wait patiently? It's not enough to just sit by and wait. Isn't it time that we stop waiting for the junta to change its conduct, that stronger actions are needed? Would you say Singapore would agree with that?
Well, I would say, again, let's fully subscribe to the principles of the ASEAN
Non-interference.
Charter. Non-interference. And there's good reason for that. Right? Having said that, it doesn't mean we are just going to close our eyes, pretend that everything is back to normal, recognize the junta, and say life goes on. We're not. And if you look at the most recent ASEAN summit, our leaders reaffirmed that the military leaders of Myanmar will not be represented at our summits and at meetings of the foreign minister. Myanmar remains a member of ASEAN, has access to all the information and all the arrangements that are going on, but that sense of disapproval
This is
still
a
there.
tricky one for diplomacy,
Yes.
because how would you encourage political dialogue without legitimizing? Is there a tricky balance?
No, I don't see that as a balance. They're two different
separate things?
Two separate things. We're not legitimizing the coup or the junta. But we are saying that real dialogue needs to occur across the political spectrum in Myanmar. They need to release the political detainees. President Win Min, State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi needs to be released. And then they need to be able to sit down face to face and have honest-to-goodness conversations with their political rivals or whatever term you're going to use to describe these stakeholders in Myanmar's body politic. But that's the only way. Otherwise, you're just going to continue this path of poverty, of violence, and it's a dead end. There is no future on this path.
The UN, do you see the international community helping de-escalate some of the tensions there? I know there was a resolution by the UN Security Council, the first in 74 years, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, a long time. But beyond just official condemnation, what can the international community do? What can multilateral bodies like the United Nations do?
Well, that same resolution you mentioned did also have a reference to arms. And I can certainly speak from the perspective of Singapore that we make sure no military equipment or dual-use equipment which can be used to harm the citizens of Myanmar pass through our ports into Myanmar. And I hope the other countries do so. But you know as well as I do that there is at least one major power that is supplying military equipment to the military.
Speaking of which, let's talk about the other prolonged crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Also, I think close to a year, 11 months now since the full-scale invasion. The war is geographically very far from us, but the impact on food prices, on energy prices, the proxy US-China tussle, all of that affects our region nevertheless. You have said before, Minister, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, quote, an existential issue for Singapore. I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that.
We are a tiny city-state, just 58 years old.
Much smaller than Ukraine.
Much, much smaller. When a big, powerful neighbor cites historical errors and crazy decisions to launch an invasion, redraw boundaries, change governments, all alarm bells go off. So for us, this is first and foremost a matter of principle. It is a flagrant affront to the UN Charter, to the principles of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. So we objected to this on principle. And in fact, this is the same position we took when Russia went after Crimea in 2014. So in a sense, Singapore's position is not something new. Singapore's foreign policy is consistent. It's almost predictable because we operate on these principles. Now, having said that, clearly it is a conflict with global ramifications. It has not helped the relations between the superpowers. It has certainly caused significant escalation in terms of inflation for food, energy, and it just raises the risk for all of us. So it's not just something that's happening in Ukraine. Now, the other dimension to it is how we in Asia, what lessons should we learn from this? The problem in Europe has been that since the Second World War, the question always has been, where is the line? The Iron Curtain. And then when the Berlin Wall came down, was that line moving eastwards progressively? In Southeast Asia, we don't want a line. Our concept is Southeast Asia should be overlapping circles of friends. And the better we can execute this, and the better we can engage with all the superpowers and stakeholders in our region, the better. Because we want to make sure that this kind of conflict does not emerge in our part of the world.
Okay, that's quite interesting. I do want to come to that shortly, but I'm curious to hear your views on how you think the crisis in Ukraine might be resolved. I mean, 1 year on, nobody thought it would last this long. Is there still a lack of clarity as to Russia's endgame, Russia's objectives in Ukraine and what they're willing to do to meet those objectives?
Well, the war's ongoing. I've been speaking to the foreign ministers of both Ukraine and Russia. Unfortunately, I don't see any sign of a real commitment to negotiations in good faith at this point in time. You know, the tragedy of wars is that even when it is obvious that negotiations are needed, because all battles ultimately end with negotiations on the table. But the tragedy sometimes is that both sides have sustained losses to the point which they can't muster the political capital and the leadership and the wisdom to sit down.
Too much into it.
Yes, because they've lost too much. Right? So unfortunately, both sides are now trapped in that spiral. I think it'll take some time more before cooler heads and a more long-term strategic outlook prevails, and then negotiations occur. It's very complicated, and look, we are not party to those. So it's easy for us to sit here and analyze. But if you're the leader of Ukraine, you're the leader of Russia, you're accountable to your people for the decisions you make, for the compromises which may be necessary, and for the long-term solutions which you have to make stick. So don't underestimate the difficulty. My own sense is that this will get worse before it gets better.
Well, for the rest of those who are watching, particularly those in foreign policy, what does the re-emergence of war in Europe signal to you about the current world order?
A couple of things. First, never ever believe that war is over. I mean, yes, for the last 70, 80 years, we've had a peace dividend. And in Europe, they've reached a point where they believe that war was never going to occur, at least in Western Europe.
But that was a past that they had overcome.
And then there was this concept that, well, if we are interdependent for energy, for food, for fertilizer, war does not make sense and therefore will not occur. Well, that myth got blown up. So the point is, never, never take what we have for granted. That's the first point. Second point is, and I reflected on it, say, from an Asian perspective, we don't want to be an arena for proxy wars or for neo-colonization. And for that, it also behoves all of us in Southeast Asia to band together, or we will hang individually. So that's why ASEAN is so important. That's why ASEAN, for all the criticisms about, oh, you take so long to make decisions, you insist on consensus. Well, no other part of the world has the diversity that Southeast Asia has in terms of economic systems, society, culture, forms of government. But to me, this confirms why we need ASEAN and why we need to work together, support each other, build up those habits, avoid the temptations for quick fixes, for interference in domestic affairs of other countries, avoid making appeals to external powers to solve our own regional problems. And, we're actually moving into a multipolar world. The unipolar moment where America was the only superpower with the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, that's come to an end. But it is equally wrong to assume we're now just simply transiting into a bipolar world where it's just the US and China. In fact, what we are witnessing now, there's the US, there's China, there's Europe, there's India, later Africa and South America, but the real sleeper hit is Southeast Asia.
You reckon it's one of the polarities in a multipolar
Of course. No, just
world?
let me give you some statistics for that. We've got 660 million people in Southeast Asia. That's a European-sized population. Our combined GDP is about 3.2 trillion US dollars. That's actually still small for our population, but 60% of our population is below the age of 35. We've got a demographic dividend to harvest in the next 2 decades. ASEAN can be the 5th largest economy globally within the next 2 decades, right? If you were to go to China and ask China, who is your largest trading partner? Is it America or the EU? The Chinese will tell you it is Southeast Asia. If I check with the Americans, where has America invested more than it has invested in India, China, and Japan combined? Do you know what the answer is? Southeast Asia. So we count.
Okay.
So don't discount Southeast Asia. We are a pole, and a growing pole in a multipolar world. And look at Southeast Asia, deal with us on our own merits, and not just through the prism of, well, US-China competition.
We tend
That's
to do
the
that.
point.
We tend to
Too
do
many
that.
people do that, and that is actually simply wrong factually.
Well, in this transition to a multipolar world, with all the different poles, as you mentioned, Singapore, away from ASEAN,
Yes.
well, how is Singapore looking at other poles? How is Singapore going to relate to these big powers?
Well, again, I can only share with you the perspective of Singapore. As I said, a tiny city-state, multiracial, multi-religious, cosmopolitan society in the heart of Southeast Asia. Our trade is about 3 times our GDP. So when Singapore says we believe in economic integration, we believe in free trade, we believe in multilateral free trade agreements, we believe in the rule of law, we believe in peaceful resolution of these disputes. These are not debating points for us. This is
Principle.
lifeblood. No, it's even beyond principle. It is lifeblood. Because a world which is fractured, fractious, divided, polarized, and at war is a very dangerous world for a tiny city-state like Singapore. So that's why, we will do our best to stand with our neighbors. Number one neighbor, obviously, is Malaysia, and with ASEAN. We will continue to integrate our economies. We will continue to facilitate the transformation towards green and the digital revolution, which is occurring in all our societies. We will make sure our digital systems interoperate. I mean, for instance, in Singapore, we can send money to each other. I don't need your bank account number, I only need your phone number. We're now linking that with Thailand, we're linking that with India, but I would hope that we should shortly see such a system across Southeast Asia. Now, that's not just technology for its sake, but every small shopkeeper, every small farmer, every hawker, every artist and artisan can sell, can trade, can settle. Low barriers to entry. Do you see the point I'm trying to make? And that we do this in the digital space, and even as we transit into the green economy, renewable energy, solar energy, the hydrogen economy. Think of how much can be achieved if Southeast Asia is on the forefront of that. And yet, if you actually look at the map of Southeast Asia and the natural resources which Southeast Asia has, both in terms of energy, renewable energy, and the minerals needed for the digital economy, we're in the game.
It's funny because all of these things, often we tend to look from a very domestic point of view. How do we implement these types of strategies within national borders? But actually, it's a foreign policy issue. It's really to do with how you connect to other countries, interconnectedness, particularly in the region.
Foreign policy begins at home. So you've got to first make the pitch to your own people.
Okay. You need the buy-in.
For why it makes sense to lower barriers, interoperate, integrate, and to stick by the rule of law. And international agreements mean so much. I'll just come back to Malaysia and Singapore. I mentioned, we got divorced 58 years ago. but we're still always going to be living in the same house, right? And when there was a fire or a threat to the house, we looked after each other. That builds confidence. For the future, there will always be issues where we will have divergence or even disagreements on. But here I can tell you categorically, at least as far as Singapore and Malaysia is concerned, we have always stuck to the rule of law. We have always had peaceful dispute resolution. Sometimes we win, sometimes Malaysia wins. It doesn't matter. The fact is, we play by the rules. Right. And that's wonderful. Okay. And that's why I'm confident that, you know, we won't agree on everything, but we will continue methodically, deliberately, progressively solve problems, and we will do a lot more together.
Can I very quickly ask you, in the minute or so that we have left, the priorities for this year? I mean, you listed a very fractious world and multiple crises happening.
Yes.
What would be your foreign policy priority?
Well, in the immediate term, I think we are at the end of round one of COVID-19. So we're all reopening our economies, and to do that safely. At the same time, bear in mind that we are now into a world where it's no longer just about just-in-time inventories, but just in case, which means I think all of us are now prepared to pay a premium for reliability, trustworthiness, resilience. And again, you know, two countries like Malaysia and Singapore, which have proven that through the crisis, I think we're well on that road. Beyond that, with Malaysia, we've also exploring opportunities in the digital and in the green space. And that's going to be a very rich harvest in the, I would say, the next 5-10 years, the decades to come. So we've got a full plate on our agendas.
On that note, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Most welcome. Enjoyed my time here.
That was my conversation with His Excellency Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, Singapore's Minister for Foreign Affairs. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.